am here today to talk to you about the work that we do at Faster Cures and a little bit about some of the things that we heard about this morning in terms of, in terms of the advances in medical research. So I'll talk about where are we today, where do we think we're going to be tomorrow, and what are some of the challenges and solutions, and then I'll talk about my organization, which is called Faster Cures. So my organization, we're based in Washington, D.C. We are a center of the Milken Institute, which is based out in California. We look across all of the sectors in medical research and across all of the diseases to try to understand how can we make a system that is a little bit more efficient and more effective. Our mission is very clear, which is we're trying to accelerate the process of discovery. So whether it's because of lack of medical breakthroughs, AKA the science is hard and challenging, or limited resources, there's never enough money, there's never enough sort of raw material, and I'll talk about some of those issues, or restrictive public policies, I want to make the point that it's really the patients who are ultimately going to pay the price. So transforming the system is really going to take all of the stakeholders in medical research to come together. And that's something that my organization focuses on, is who are the different players in the medical research system? You heard this morning from some of those players, and you'll hear after me about some other players. It's a real puzzle in terms of the different players, the different sectors. And so represented on this slide, I have some of those players and sectors represented. I want to key in on a few. The NIH, which provides a lot of funding for basic research. They do some in the translational and the clinical research arena, but it is really vital money that has provided the seeds, if you will, that we can then sort of till the soil to get scientific discovery. You have up here academic medicine. You have venture capital. They fund a lot of the early stage work in the biotechnology sector. You also have another core area called venture philanthropy, and you will hear from one of the venture philanthropy groups, Cure Alzheimer's Fund, after this, and the Food and Drug Administration, and you'll hear more about that. So, as we heard this morning, transformation is absolutely happening in this arena. So we have unprecedented scientific discovery. We have the mapping and sequencing of the human genome. We have a very educated and robust patient population. We have a lot of new business models, the promise of personalized medicine, the advent of digitized medical records, and yet we still have some challenges to deal with. So here I'm talking about transparency, accountability, outcomes. These are buzzwords that you're all familiar with from your business professions, but we're starting to ask the medical research system to be accountable as well. And so that return on investment is really going to be measured in quality of life and well-being. And from my vantage point in my organization, how are we doing in terms of getting treatments and cures through the pipeline? So this morning you heard a little bit about some of the confounding factors to medical advancements. And so I don't want to miss an opportunity to talk to you about some of the critical needs facing our country. We have an obesity epidemic that was alluded to. We have a serious problem with chronic diseases. And so I point out here, you can't see it very well, but if you go to the Milken Institute website, there's a report that they released called An Unhealthy America, where they really went through and looked at what is the current situation with chronic disease in our country. And so this slide talks about the economic burden of chronic diseases. Ultimately, the impact on our economy is $1.3 trillion. So that is money that will be taken out of the medical research system and be applied to the care delivery system if we don't start to act on some of these initiatives. Also, we have changing demographics in our country that are accelerating the need for some of these treatments and cures. So where do we go from here? I spoke earlier, we need to and we need to ultimately transform the drug development process. So at Faster Cures, we talk about how embedded in each of us is really a Rosetta Stone. So we look at the biospecimen arena, when you donate blood, when you get a tissue sample taken, DNA samples. Also, if you have electronic medical records, that's vital data that can be used. And then if you partake in clinical research, if you participate in a clinical trial. We have a program called the Patients Helping Doctors program that really looks at how can we improve these systems? How can we accelerate research by having better biospecimen collection? How can we use that health information technology to advance medicine and really mine that data? And how can we have more effective clinical trial design? Because right now, one of the things I want to point out to you is that only, as you see on the slide, 3 to 5% of adults who are diagnosed with cancer partake in clinical research. And that there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that physicians often are uncomfortable referring patients to clinical trials. It's challenging for patients to understand what their options are. We know that in the case of pediatric cancer, it's a very high percentage. It's up towards 90% of children with cancer enroll in clinical trials. And I've talked to experts about this, and they've said, well, if a child is diagnosed with cancer, we move very quickly to get that child into the cream of the crop medical system. We try to get them into a clinical research study so they're really riding the wave, the cutting edge of medical research. But sadly, we don't do the same as adults. And again, there's many challenges that get in the way of us participating. I'll tell the story at the end, if I have a moment, about my dad's experience with a clinical trial. He was diagnosed with leukemia and partook in a trial. It didn't change the outcome of his disease. He died in the exact same amount of time, 6 months from diagnosis. But it gave incredible meaning to his disease, and it allowed him to leave behind a legacy of participation. So we need to transform that drug development process. It takes too long. Did you know that it takes 15 years on average to get from a scientific discovery to a treatment? And think about a diagnosis that you might receive or have already received, because I predict that we're all either patients already or we will be at some point. 15 years is a long time to wait for an advancement. And I could rattle off many, many diseases that there are really not a lot of options available. The options that are available may have been discovered decades ago. We also know that it costs too much to develop drugs. And this slide illustrates that point. And therapeutic options are limited, as I referenced. Also, we're seeing a slower pipeline come out of drug discovery. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One thing I'd like to point out is if you look at the pharma business model, so this slide looks at the pharma biotech sector, and it is a slide that illustrates the price-earnings ratio. I'm not an economist by training. I work for a group that has many health economists. But this slide gives the price-earnings ratios for the major companies. So kind of keep that in mind. And then I'll show you this slide, which is really looking at consumer products. So companies that create products like potato chips, lipstick, all sorts of consumer goods, things that we all consume, and I'm certainly one of those consumers. But look at the price-earnings ratio over there. And then if you look at this slide, it gives you a comparison. So this illustrates how we're valuing pharmaceutical research. I am not up here to talk about the benefits of investing in a pharma company. They have a long, tough road ahead of them right now, as any of you, who've been keeping up with that would know. But I point this out because I try to sensitize people to just even how we're looking at medical research in this country. So we've heard about the promise of mapping and sequencing the human genome. And this Time magazine cover shows Dr. Venter and Collins when they announced the discovery of mapping and sequencing the genome. And there's a lot of people who are saying, okay, what did we get for that? And where are all of the treatments and cures? Obviously, the road was a more complex one than anyone predicted. And in order for us to see that the best is yet to come, we have much to do. So the challenges, I've referred to many of them. This maze illustrates some of them. I'll focus on collaboration. We need a scientific infrastructure that allows scientists to actually collaborate. And there's many disincentives for that to happen. We have an IP structure that needs to be addressed. We have funding gaps. We have a regulatory model that really needs to advance. And we're doing this in the context of globalization. So I heard some of the other presenters referencing things that were going on in other countries. So if you look at China or Singapore or India or Brazil, I could name many other countries, many of them are investing heavily in medical research at a time, I might add, where I think that we are sort of entering into a period of fiscal austerity for federal funding that really could have grave consequences. So key questions remain unanswered, and in the circles that I travel in, it makes everyone uncomfortable because people are starting to ask, what am I getting for my investment? And the scientific community isn't always happy about that conversation. And then the second thing is, people do get a diagnosis and they say, well, who's in charge of my cures? So one of the persons that you may have heard about, or I know Debbie Brooks from the Michael J. Fox Foundation spoke here last year. Michael J. Fox said this. He said, who's in charge of my cures? He didn't, I think, know when he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, what we knew and what we didn't know. So you have a sort of a media storm where we're starting to ask these things in a very public way. So some of the solutions that we have been looking at reside in very small places. So this venture philanthropy sector is a very small piece of the medical research funding pie, but it represents a lot of entrepreneurialism and innovation. And it is very much modeled after the business community. How can we get a return on investment? How can we collaborate? How can we have results-driven research? This slide, it's difficult to read, but it represents many of the groups that my organization works with. We try to understand what are their best practices and disseminate those as fast and rapidly as we can, because we believe that they have many of the answers to fixing some of the things that ail the system. So some of those practices include things like targeted use of their money. It might surprise you to understand that the National Institutes of Health has certain ways they have to give their money out. They have certain systems they're obligated to. There are some changes underway, but they don't have the ability to take their entire budget and direct it the way that they just feel like on a particular day. It's a very collaborative model, this venture philanthropy piece. They have streamlined grant making, which is they can get their money out the door very quickly. And they often require that scientists who get funding do data sharing in a very different way and come together to really share what they're doing. And ultimately, the majority of these groups have patients at the center of what they're doing. And that's something that I want you to think about, is how can we put patients back at the center of the system? So this funding pie represents that small slice of medical philanthropy that I referenced. It's been a fairly static piece of the pie, but I would argue one of the most innovative pieces of that funding pie. So my organization has looked at this issue, how can we create a better return on investment? So for any of you who do philanthropic giving, whether it's in medical philanthropy or other arenas, you want to give to a place that you feel comfortable with, that sort of agrees with your principles, your philosophy, but you also want to understand what are you getting? What are the outcomes? So we created, if you go to the right-hand side of this slide, some assessment metrics. Very basic, looking at things like accountability, collaboration, effectiveness of research, how are they resource building? And so we have many reports and tools that we can provide to you around that issue of medical philanthropy. In the public policy arena, there is much to be done right now. As I referenced, the National Institutes of Health, the FDA, many other health agencies, most agencies actually, I would argue, are looking sort of squarely in the eye at some budget cuts. So the founder and chairman of my organization, Mike Milken, authored this piece in the Wall Street Journal back in just last month in February, where he talked about healthcare investment and really tried to argue for a long-term assessment. So one of the pullout quotes is just looking at improved public health translates directly into greater national productivity, which really underpins all economic growth. He went on to discuss our sort of where are we going to fit in the solar system of medical research, because as I pointed out, we're really now operating in a global society as it relates to medical research, countries like China, their investment is dwarfing what we can do if you look at proportion, and it's really on the upswing. One of the issues that was touched upon in that Wall Street Journal piece that I wanted to make sure that you understood as an example of a public policy issue that really impacts all of us each and every day is our investment in the Food and Drug Administration. I'm not sure if everyone understands that the FDA regulates 25 cents of every consumer dollar that is spent in the United States. And so we look at the volume of money that it gets versus the sort of proportion of duty that it has. And in the medical research arena, feel very strongly that their ability to keep up with scientific advancements and keep treatments moving through the pipeline out of the FDA will be impacted severely if funding gets dramatically cut. I come from Washington, D.C., and one of the surrounding counties that you may have heard of is Montgomery County, Maryland. So Montgomery County, Maryland, the school superintendent's budget is right now, it is parallel with the Food and Drug Administration commissioner's budget. So it speaks well for the citizens of Montgomery County that they have so much money in their school system, but it doesn't speak well right now for a federal agency that has so much to do. So this talks about some of the things that it's responsible for, and again, it's doing it in a very global environment. So my organization is part of a group that looks at how can we increase appropriated dollars, how can we increase the scientific robustness of the agency, and so we have a lot of policy solutions for that. So this looks at the continuum that I've just been talking about in a very rapid way, from beginning of discovery to the end when we get something out of the Food and Drug Administration. And we have this translation gap in the middle. Well, if you look at it here, it's a very horizontal continuum. We like to turn it into more of a circular approach that really is constantly learning from each component. So even something when it's approved by the FDA needs to be continually studied to evaluate how is it going to work once it's actually disseminated into a patient population. So again, you have to put patients at the center of that. Some of the things that we've heard in this conference thus far, some of the buzzwords are up here. Do we have an app for that? When will we harness the potential of personalized medicine? What are some of the roadblocks? What about this scientific revolution? And I would argue that all of this is happening simultaneously. So as much as I've spoken to you to try to shed light on some of the challenges, there's incredible promise and scientific discovery going on. But I think that we just need to pay attention to fixing some of those challenges. And I ask all of you to help join us in this transformative enterprise as we take a medical research system that was and turn it into something that we all want it to be. So I ask you to engage with us. I really encourage you all, as you are patients or become patients, to become very engaged with your care providers, with your care systems, with your research systems, ask questions, participate in clinical trials if that's an opportunity or an option for you. We really need to bring all of these sectors together to continually learn. This shows you some of the ways that you can be engaged here with us at Faster Cures. I just want to speak briefly back to the story that I told of my father. He was diagnosed, he was a retiree on vacation here in Florida with my mother. This was 5 years ago, working out on the treadmill as every active person does who is over the age of 80, which he was. And he felt a little odd, thought it was his heart medication, went to the doctor. The doctor said, wow, your blood work's really a mess, let's bring you in. He received a diagnosis of leukemia. And again, to go back to my story, the local community oncologist back up in the Washington area said, sir, I don't think we have anything to offer for you here. You can do these really harsh medications or get your affairs in order and you'll die in 6 months. And my dad, because of all the people that he knew who were in the medical research system, said, well, isn't there some way that I can participate in something, even if it doesn't benefit me? And the doctor said, well, why would you want to put yourself through that? Long story short, he went to Johns Hopkins, received amazing medical care, had, I think, one of the most sort of seminal experiences of his life, and certainly of my mother's life, as he really was at the cutting edge of research. So he ended up dying in the same period of time, but it really gave important meaning to his life to sort of take, control of that experience. So I tell that story to remind all of us to continue to think about our spirit of volunteerism as it relates to the medical research system. Because I think if you're not a trained professional, it can seem daunting to get engaged, but I think you all need to. And I'll close with this quote from Dr. Francis Collins. He directs the National Institutes of Health, and he talked about this being a remarkable time of discovery where the opportunities are exciting and very urgent, and that the promise is real. Now, I will add that the challenges are real and the solutions are out there, and we need all of your help to partake in that so that we can all sort of live to see the better day of what scientific advancements there really are. Thank you very much for your time.